In this section, we're finally going to talk about the process of actually planting a seedling. We'll look at microsite preparation, handling a seedling from bag to hole, the motions of planting a tree, then closing the hole and moving on to your next spot. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're not even going to touch on spacing and density. Those things will be covered in the next section. For now, let's assume that you know roughly where your tree needs to go within an area of, say, a couple feet. The microsite is the spot where you plant a tree. In order to maximize the survival potential of the seedling, you need to select the best possible microsite. Each tree has already undergone physiological stresses in the process of transporting it to the moment of planting. It's your job to minimize future stresses through careful microsite selection. As long as you're spacing correctly, you can choose from many different microsites, such as on a mound, in a depression, beside a stump, under a bush, or in a rotten log. Each of these spots provides different growing conditions for the seedling, and you need to understand what the seedling needs in order to choose the best one. Some of those spots that I just mentioned might not be acceptable as microsites on certain contracts. Some factors to consider when selecting the best microsite include: utilize any existing site preparation if the area has been site prepped for planting. Only plant in an acceptable planting medium. Some contracts will have very specific criteria for what you're allowed to plant in. You may be asked to utilize existing stumps to provide some protection for the planted seedlings, as they're often slightly raised and usually offer protected, undamaged soil pockets right beside the stump. This is called obstacle planting, because you're planting beside an obstacle. Even if you aren't asked specifically to do obstacle planting, targeting spots that are 6 to 12 inches away from existing stumps is generally a good practice on most contracts. Learn to recognize which specific vegetation indicates suitable pockets for planting. Think wisely. Don't choose a spot where it's hard to plant a tree if there's an easier acceptable microsite just a foot away. This will come into play when we talk about spacing.
Before planting an area, you'll be briefed on expectations for microsite preparation. This often varies from contract to contract and sometimes even from block to block. Screefing is the removal of unwanted material from the planting spot and may or may not be required. In some instances, the size of the screef is specified in the planting prescription, perhaps something like 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. You may use your boot for a minor screef, or you may also need to use your shovel for a larger or deeper one, depending on the ground conditions on the block. Screefing is extra work and can create musculoskeletal strain, so you'll want to be careful in the methods you use to screef. Smart planters can often reduce or eliminate some screefing entirely by using careful microsite selection. Smart foresters have minimal screefing requirements because it means lower bid prices from contractors. Don't make the classic first-year planter mistake by spending a full minute screefing through heavy grass mat if there's exposed soil in a spot only a foot away. The correct technique for boot screefing and for shovel screefing will be shown to you in the field by your instructor or your foreman. The technique may vary slightly depending on site conditions. Shovel screefing will feel very awkward when you first start planting, but after 10 or 20,000 shovel screefs, it starts to feel very normal, comfortable, and efficient.
Let's assume that you've already picked the best spot for the tree. The goal here is to have a hole of sufficient depth. The hole needs to be sufficiently straight and vertical. The roots of the seedling must be straight up and down, and the plug will be covered with dirt or organics to just over the top of the root collar. The root collar of the seedling is the space between the top of the plug and the bottom of the needles or laterals. The term lateral refers to the small branches on the seedling. Assuming that you've picked your spot, and depending on the rockiness of the ground, you may want to prod gently with your shovel to make sure you won't be driving your shovel into a rock, root, or other hard ground, which could increase the risk of long-term injuries. If most of the ground on the block is soft, this may not be necessary. Taking the time to choose a microsite carefully will usually make planting easier for you and better for the tree. Push your shovel in. There are different techniques depending on the terrain. If the ground is soft, you should be able to drive it in with one strong thrust of your arm. You might want to lift the shovel a bit first and use gravity and the weight of the shovel to help your arm out. If the ground is rocky, many planters prefer to wiggle the blade of the shovel to help it find a path around the rocks. Use your kicker when added pressure is required. Try alternating your feet on the kickers. If possible, try to always kick on the outside of the shovel, i.e. on the right kicker plate if you're holding the shovel in your right hand and kicking with your right foot, or on the left kicker plate if you're holding the shovel in your left hand and kicking with your left foot. Being ambidextrous when you're planting prevents some stress on your body. This is another reason why I don't recommend that planters cut off one of their kickers. However, kicking on the inside kicker plate is usually more awkward for your body, so try not to get into that habit. Experiment with different ways to handle the shovel, as some methods may suit your body type better than others. Also, it will be to your benefit to have a few different styles that you're comfortable with, so you're more able to adapt to changes in terrain. Next, you need to open the hole. There are different techniques for doing this in order to open a hole that's deep and wide enough to fit your hand, as well as accommodating the seedling's plug. The plug is the part of the tree that has the dirt surrounding the roots. No matter what eventual technique you become familiar with for opening a hole, start off by pushing forward. Almost all first-year planters put their shovel into the ground and pull back. I think this must be a natural movement that roughly mimics digging in a pile of dirt with a garden shovel. Don't do this. You don't want to pull backwards first. Make a conscious effort to push forward first. As you get faster, you'll get more of a fluid motion built up, where as you're moving to your next spot, you'll be throwing the shovel forward and into the ground. As you continue to move closer to the hole, the shovel ends up naturally pushing forward with your body motion. It wouldn't be possible to be moving towards a new hole and pulling backwards on a shovel simultaneously. As you're moving toward the hole that you're about to make, take your non-shovel hand and reach into your draw bag to pull out the next tree that you're about to plant. For efficiency, you need to be doing several things simultaneously whenever possible. That means getting the tree ready for the hole at the same time that you're making the hole. This step is an important one in terms of stock handling too. You want to grab the entire seedling at once, including the roots. Don't just grab the top of the tree. If you grab it by the top, you're going to end up pulling needles or the leader bud off of a lot of your trees. This is terrible for the seedling, as it basically knocks back a year of growth or even kills the tree. Now, this is a tricky part that a lot of foresters don't understand. They want you to stand the trees up perfectly in your planting bags, rather than have them all lying on their sides. The rationale is that they don't want you to be bending the stems and harming the seedlings. But that doesn't matter if you're pulling the tops of the trees as you're pulling them out of your bags. The best approach that I've found, and a lot of foresters understand this when you explain it to them, is to lay the trees in your bags at an angle. If they're angled, it's easy to grab them by the main stem of the seedling and the plug simultaneously. Ultimately, that's the best treatment for the seedlings. For now, though, be aware that some foresters may still tell you that they want the trees completely vertical in your bags.
The best way to put the seedling into the hole is to slide it across the back of your shovel, especially if you have a tight hole, because the shovel is smooth enough to protect the plug on one side from ripping. The fact that the tree is cupped in your fingers means that your knuckles protect the plug on the front. Make sure your fingers extend all the way down to the bottom of the plug. Put the tree in the hole, then pull out your shovel. Some planters prefer to make a larger hole, which is easier to work with. This is one of those counterintuitive steps about efficiency. You'd think that making a larger hole would take more time and slow you down. Yes, it may take an extra second or two, but sometimes you more than make up for that time if you can get the tree into the hole really quickly, and you don't have to fight with shoving it into a tight hole. Either way, at this point, you have to make sure that the roots are straight. You need to learn to do this by feel, because you won't always be able to look in and visually inspect the roots. This is probably the most important part of planting, in my opinion. I can't begin to emphasize how much long-term pain you'll cause for yourself if you don't make sure that all your tree roots are straight. Bent roots is a type of quality fault. You may also have to adjust your depth a bit at this point to make sure your seedling isn't too shallow or too deep. In general, you want just a small amount of dirt above the top of the plug, perhaps a centimeter or two. Now it's time to close the hole. No matter how you close the hole, 3 objectives must be met. The plug must be covered, there should be no air pockets around the roots, and the tree should be snug enough in the ground to reduce moisture loss, but the soil should not be compacted so much that the roots are crushed. There are 3 different tools you can use to close the hole: your hand, your boot, or the shovel. For each of these 3 tools, there can be multiple techniques, especially with the boot. Learn to use them all. You'll sometimes be on blocks where you're constantly using different types of closure methods, depending on each specific microsite. Sometimes, when I plant a box of trees, I may use as many as 8 or 10 different methods of closing different holes. Closing with your hand works best in soft ground, and it's fast, but it's hard on the hands. Ease into this because it can cause tendinitis in your knuckles. But it's efficient because you're already bent over anyway. Another advantage of hand closing is more accuracy. Plus, you can sweep away loose debris from the tree at the same time as closing the hole. Closing with your shovel is a good method where soils are compact and too hard to close by hand. Care is required to avoid slashing the roots with a misguided shovel blade. This method is sometimes a bit slower, but if you're in hard ground, it does a good job. However, some planters have also learned to do it quickly in soft ground, in which case it can be extremely quick. It'll take quite a while for a first-year planter to catch on to this trick, so don't expect to be using it much when you're first learning to plant. Focus on other planting techniques and save learning this one for once you're comfortable with planting a couple thousand trees per day. At that point, your shovel control should be skilled enough to quickly learn how to shovel close holes. Closing with your boot is the most common approach. You can use the toe of your boot, or the heel, or a flat-footed stomp. You can come down from above, or move your foot at the tree in a sideways motion more like a bulldozer. By varying your kick, you can also vary the eventual depth of the tree, which is a technique that good planters gradually learn. Care must be used that you don't kick the tree itself and damage the seedling. When kicking a hole closed, it's also possible to make a tree lean over or to compact the soil too much, so pay attention to your specific techniques and the results that they give. Your instructor or foreman will go over all of these methods and will hopefully spend a lot of time watching you plant so they can correct mistakes in your techniques. Planting a tree quickly with proper quality is an art and a science. On your first few days of planting, you'll feel incredibly awkward and you'll think that you'll never be able to plant several thousand trees in a day. After a week or so, it'll start to feel a little bit less awkward. By the end of 4 weeks, you'll be moving fluidly across the block. After a couple years, planting will feel almost effortless to you. You'll feel almost like a dancer moving across the block, and your planting techniques will have become very refined and elegant. But first, you have to practice a lot and plant a couple 100,000 trees. So here we have a pot full of gravelly mineral soil, and you can probably see right now the surface of it looks pretty dry. And as we start working with this over the next few minutes, you're going to see that the soil is actually pretty moist down inside. And this is something you'll notice on the blocks a lot. The top layer tends to dry out from evaporation and from water seeping into the ground over time, over a day or a couple days. So this is a pretty traditional look in some areas when it hasn't rained for a few days. So for tools, what I have here is I have a bundle of spruce trees. And so the wrapper just comes off them. And then you can see all of these individual trees. And so we'll work with some of those as we're doing the planting demonstration. I do have a pine tree here also. I have a Bush Pro shovel. And this, you know, if I was to hold it normally to plant, it's a little difficult to do that with this kind of a demonstration. So I brought in a tool that we don't use for planting, but which I'll just use for this video, a simple garden trowel. And you can kind of see the difference in size between the shovel and the trowel. But basically, when you're planting, this is something that a lot of people don't understand at first. I see so many first-time planters, they stick the shovel in the ground and they immediately pull back. Okay, that's not the way that you want to do it. Your first job is you're going to be pushing forward. Remember that. Push forward. Okay? Now, let's see if we can smooth this out a little bit. Basically, the whole motions involved in planting a tree are pretty simple. Shovel in the ground, and you want to try and have it going in straight up and down vertically. You don't want to be putting your shovel in this way. You don't want to be putting your shovel in this way. I mean, I can see people doing this as they're walking up to a spot and they've got their shovel out in front of them. I can see people that stop at a spot, they lean over, and because they're bent over, they jam it in this way. But no matter what, try and get it straight up and down as it goes in. And then you're going to go forward first and then pull back. Now, as you're putting it in and pulling back, you're trying not to pivot, because that pivot tends to open a hole at the bottom, open a hole at the top, and not so much of a hole at the pivot point in the middle. That's not very effective. Once you get it in, you want to try and have it so that the bottom of the shovel is what's pivoting. Pushes forward, pulls back, so you've got more of a triangle, a V that is vertical on one side and sloped on the other. Okay, that's what you get. I just took a moment to moisten the soil a little bit, so it's a little bit easier to work with. Of course, it's not going to be perfect like this all the time when you're out on the blocks, but for the purposes of this video, that's okay. Okay, so when you're working with your shovel, depending on which side of your body is your dominant side, you're going to do 3 things that match the dominant side. So for most people, if you're right-handed, your right is your dominant side. And the 3 things that you're going to do, right, are you going to hold the shovel in your right hand, you're going to kick it in with your right leg if you kick, and you're going to kick on the right side of the shovel, the outside, not the inside. Okay, so let's say that we've got, boom, the shovel is in the ground, we've made this hole. Now, since your right hand is what's holding the shovel, it's your left hand that's grabbing the tree out. Now, when you grab the tree, you're going to try and put your fingers around it like this. And you want your fingers right down to the very bottom of the tree. Don't hold it up here. Don't hold it up here. Because as you put that plug in the ground, it's possible for the bottom to bend. And that's when you start getting your J roots. Okay? So if you've got your fingers right down to the tip, you don't have to be able to see. You can do this with your eyes closed, and you can feel that the roots are straight up and down because your finger's on them. That's good. Also, it's almost impossible for it to bend back this way because your fingers can't bend like that. Okay, so reach into your draw bag, pull out your tree, make sure your hand's in this kind of position, plug cupped inside the hand, and then what you're going to do is, for me being a right-handed person, I'm going to put the tree and sweep it, because the tree's in the left hand, I'm going to sweep it to the left and straighten it up. Okay, my right hand is still on the shovel the whole time. And then once I can tell with my fingers that the tree's roots are perfectly straight, then I pull the shovel out and then I'll close the hole somehow. Now, there's different ways of closing the hole. Some people, once the tree's in there, will kick. And let's pretend this is my heel, not my hand. And so you'll kick, boom, and push the dirt up against it that way. Okay? Another way. Now, the problem with that kick is sometimes as you're kicking, you're bending the tree away from you. So you have to watch out for that because you don't want that tree leaning in the direction that you're working. Okay? Now, another way of closing it, you've got the tree tucked in, is then you hand close. So you can do a couple things. You can paw dirt back towards the tree like this first, and then push it against the tree and close it like that. Or something I like is you can do a clench and you can squeeze the dirt around it. Okay? Now it's a little hard to do this quickly and efficiently in a pot of soil here without a real shovel, but let's go through this again. So shovel in, straight up and down, push forward first, then pull back, tree cupped in your hand, sweeps in. And the neat thing is, it's better if you have a big hole, but if you don't have a big hole, then you can use the smoothness of the back of the shovel and kind of push the tree's roots, the plug, against the shovel as you're sweeping across, and you can really tuck it in pretty hard there if you have to. Okay, so once the tree's roots are in, the shovel comes out, and you either kick it, or you use your shovel somehow, or you squeeze it around like that. And the nice thing about the squeeze, hand closing, is that you tend to have a really straight tree. With kicking, there's a whole bunch of different ways to kick. So let me see if I can get a work boot here and demonstrate. Okay, so I have a work boot here. I pull the shovel out, and then the boot comes in, and the heel can kick and close that hole. Okay? Tree might be bent a little bit, but you can straighten it up while you're still bent over. That's the key thing. You do this kick while you're bent over, because then if you have to straighten the tree up, you don't want to bend over a second time. Okay, so that's the heel close. That, you can get a lot of force with a heel close. Okay, secondly, let's say that we want to do a flat-footed kick. So that's going to be more like this. And obviously it doesn't work too well here in this pot, but it's a good solid tamp like that. A third type of kick that you can do is you'll do what I call a toe tap. And so instead of your whole boot being flat, it's more of the toe is going to go in and tamp it down like this. You're at a bit of an angle. Okay, again, your tree is leaning, so you might have to take your hand and straighten it up manually. And so any of those methods, you want to straighten your tree out. You want to do your kick while you're still bent over. Your body will become pretty flexible. You'll get used to it. And then straighten the tree and then stand up. But, like I say, this kind of a hand close does a really good job of leaving a straight tree. Shovel in, forward, back, grab the tree out of your draw bag, cup it, squeeze it, slide it in, and then, okay? And you see that I put some pressure as I was doing that. I put some pressure on as I was doing that because I was squeezing downwards and with my fingers to make sure that that hole gets closed. And I'm actually, it's hard to tell, but my whole arm right now is pushing down on the ground to help make sure the tree is tight. Okay, and then that's when the forester will come in afterwards and he'll poke his or her fingers around. No, can't really find where the shovel hole was, so that's perfect. Now, what if you didn't close it very well? Okay, they might come in and they poke their fingers, and you see how easily my finger kind of sunk right down there? That's when they're going to get unhappy, become unhappy, because, you know, a little bit of rainwater, that soft spot could sink right down and your roots be exposed, something like that. So do your squeeze, and you can see how my fingers squeezed around to make sure that hole was closed. Then when I poke, it's not so soft. Okay, now the next thing, when they're checking for quality, for depth, they're going to be looking from the surface and, okay, don't see the plug. And then a lot of times what they'll do is if there's any litter, they'll brush that away. Okay, still don't see the plug. And then sometimes what they'll do is they'll give it a little twirl. And if the dirt right here is moving around as you're twirling the tree, it's not in this example, but if it was, that's when they might say it's shallow. So let's look at how deep this is. Okay, I'm going to pinch it right there at the surface. And then when you pull it out, the tree, it's a little bit more than one finger. It's like 1.5 fingers are covered by dirt, and that's great. In most places, that's a really good depth. Okay, so let's look at some other examples. Let's say that you put it in, you squeeze it here, okay? From the surface, looks like it's not shallow because I don't see the plug. Go to do the twist. Oh, I don't know if you can see that well on the camera, but you can see the hole, the top of the plug is right there. So if I were to pinch, pull it out, see the top of the plug is right at the surface in this example. And in most places, the forester is going to want to see it deeper. Now, you can judge some trees like this one. This area between the top of the plug and the very first needles or the lowest branch, this section is called the root collar. And so the root collar is pretty big on this one. On some trees, it's a lot, you know, the needles will start very close to the top of the plug. But if you have a big root collar like this, if you walk into a plantation and you can see, as you're walking by from the surface, you can see that root collar where there's no needles, then you're going to know right off the bat that tree is pretty shallow. You don't even have to do the twist to see the ground moving on the top. Okay, so in a case like that, remember deeper usually is better. So let's say I put this one in and it's closed. As I'm walking by, I can see that needles go right down to the level of the dirt. If I were to squeeze at the surface level and pull the tree out, you can see that it's covered with a couple fingers of dirt, and that's good. So most beginning planters have a tendency to put the trees in way too shallow. You know, there'll be trees like this all over the place. Or they start getting to the point where they think, well, I've got them deep enough, can't see it. That's not good. What you want to do is get it down deeper So the bottom of the branches is kind of where the ground level is. Now you don't want to go too deep. You know, it's possible, now that I've said this to you and you're panicking about planting shallow trees, it's possible that you're going to go far too deep. So you put a tree in, you squeeze the stuff around, okay? So from the surface, yeah, it looks good. We've got needles right down to the ground level. Let's check it. So we're going to squeeze at the dirt level, pull it out. Ah, okay. So we are more than 3 fingers deep. And you can see this bottom branch, this bottom lateral, and this one, we're actually underground. That's a bit too deep. Now, if your tree in the ground, see how these laterals come out sideways? Let's say the soil level is deep enough that the base of the laterals is slightly underground, but it's kind of pinched like this, and so the branches are still growing up out of the ground. That's okay in most places. However, if the soil is the same depth and yet these laterals go down underground, that's going to be bad. So you want, as you're planting the tree, it's nice to kind of have the branches up in the air so that as you put it in the hole, they're still going to be up in the air coming out. Now, so what other kind of problems can we have? Well, we talked about leaners. Let's say that we've booted this closed and it's leaning like this. Is that leaning too far? V? Yeah, that's a little bit too far. So, simple solution, stand it up with your hands. Looks good there. Okay? And actually, the roots in this case are straight up and down. So it's possible that as you plant it, basically your roots down there are straight up and down, and just the way that you've kicked has bent the tree over a little bit. So that's not great for the tree. So if that happens, you know, the roots right now are straight, but the tree's bent a little bit. If that happens, straightening it up this way is not a bad thing. It's actually good. And the tree looks good. Okay? If you start off, let's say that your shovel hole is in like this too much, and your tree's on a huge angle, and then you close it, and then straighten it up, well, you can. That's not the best tree. If the forester digs it up, he might say, oh, your roots are sloping a lot. They're not bent, but they're sloping. Okay, so get that shovel and hole straight up and down, and then you've got a good looking tree. So what other faults are there? Well, there's the unacceptable backfill. I can't demonstrate that here because it's all good dirt. You know, we don't have grass or something to fill the hole with. How loose is it? Well, you grab a few of these top needles and pull. I'm off camera here, but grab a few of the needles at the top, and when I pull, the needles come off. So that's certainly in tight enough. We've checked, and it feels firm all around, so we know we don't have an air pocket. We know the roots are straight because we felt them in there and felt that they were straight. So I think this is going to be a pretty good looking tree. Okay. Now you're a little bit more likely to get leaners with pine trees in theory, because some of them, this one's a pretty rigid tree actually, but some pine trees are really floppy and they'll fall right over. But the same thing applies. If you put that pine tree in deep enough and then you squeeze the dirt up around it, you can have a perfectly straight pine tree. There's no excuse for not planting straight trees. Okay? So, yeah, that's the basics. Planting a tree is very, very simple, especially when you have really, really nice dirt like this. So let's grab a clean one. And you can see the length of the root collar here quite easily. It's almost an inch high. Shovel straight up and down. Tuck it in your hand. Make sure the roots are straight up and down. Squeeze around it. Make sure the hole's closed well. Tree's vertical. Depth is good. You can tell that the dirt is right up to the level of the needles. Pull it out. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so then you just have to get faster at it. Anyway, that's the basics of planting a tree. If you're trying to learn more about the tree planting industry in Canada, then a book called Step by Step, A Tree Planter's Handbook is going to be your #1 source for information. All of the information in these videos came from Step by Step, although the book contains about 3 times as much information as the videos do. Let's take a quick look at what's inside. Why do we plant trees? Health. Working safely and hazards, vehicles and transportation, camp life and other lodging, map reading. Nature and the environment, basic silviculture knowledge, stock handling, common coniferous trees, prescriptions and planning, planting equipment, camping gear and clothing, planting a seedling, meeting quality requirements, density and excess, site preparation, additional planting techniques, maximizing productivity, planting throughout Canada, applying for a job, working with helicopters, coastal planting, logging and harvesting, other silviculture work. And there's more. The few hundred pages that you just saw represent only a bit more than a third of the full book. To order a copy today, search for it on Amazon or visit replant.ca/step-by-step.